Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to ucisa's fourth CPD event, Designing Effective Governance Models. Just before we get started today, I'll just run through a little bit of housekeeping. I'm sure you're all very used to this now, but it just goes to say if you could please leave your microphones on mute throughout the session, just so that we don't get any background noises or disturbances while the presentation's underway. If you prefer, it might also be good to leave your video off during the presentation. That would just, as we are recording today's session, I would just avoid you appearing in that recording after the event. You can use the chat function just on the side to pose any questions throughout the session, and we will sort of get around to these after the presentation is finished. Shortly, we'll be posting in this chat a link to the CPD log for those of you for whom this is the first CPD event you're attending. This is just so that you can track the events and activities you've attended and been up to, so you can keep a tally of your CPD points. And we'll also be posting in a link to an attendance form, and this will be just so that you can register your attendance at this CPD event. Now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Gareth Edwards, who joins us today. He's the head of digital at the University of Greenwich, and he's going to be helping us get a better understanding of the more human side of governance. So thank you very much, Gareth, for joining us today.
No problem. Happy to be here. Just the quick standard check. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yep, you sound great.
And let me have a look and see if I can claim control somehow of the display so that I can get my slides shared with you. Let me have a quick look. I think you might have to screen share first, and I might have to take it off of you if I remember, or request it.
Okay.
Oh no, hang on, I've got it. I found it. Here we go. So let me just quickly pull this up. And can I just confirm that people can now see that?
Yep, that's come up perfectly.
Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction. Delighted to be here as kind of someone who earwigs on a fair bit of ucisa stuff. I apologize in advance because of the nature of the way Teams is. Obviously, I can't see hands going up, so I have no doubt that if something critical comes up, Richard will interrupt me and pull me onto point. But yes, just to give you a bit of background on myself. Now, hopefully you should be seeing the slides advance now. So let's just do the final check on that. And you should now be seeing a slide called Who I Am.
Yep, yeah, that's come forward.
Perfect. So I'm head of external digital at the University of Greenwich. That means if you are essentially looking at our stuff from the outside, you are probably looking at something I am responsible for. So if you think of things, that's things like the website, that's things like the blog sites and similar properties. That's not all I do. My background and continuing work outside of this is I am still a relative newcomer to the world of education and higher education in particular. My career has actually, before that, been a bit of a variety of things. My background is actually in law tech and publishing, both here and in the US, in New York. I have worked for people like Law Business Research and Haymarket and all those kind of peoples. And my career has mostly been around implementing websites and things like that, but also by definition, the more and more you get involved in that as you develop a career in that, you become something of a governance person. You can't implement sites without things like governance. You can't implement publishing programs and publishing systems without governance. In addition to that, I also am a policy and governance consultant, particularly in remits with transport. You'd be surprised how much of an overlap there is between digital infrastructure and physical infrastructure. Many of the problems that face things like railways are very, very similar to what we face when we're doing things like information management and governance in a digital world. And in fact, one of the things I will say is if you're looking to further your knowledge of how governance structures can go wrong, A very good source for that is to be found on something called the Rail Accident Investigation Bureau website, where you will find lots of reports into things like how people end up on tracks and how trains get stuck in tunnels. And you'd be unbelievably surprised at the amount of overlap there is between that and what we do. I am also an author on policy planning and politics. This is something that again overlaps with many of the other things. In that capacity, I was also head of transport policy for Rory Stewart during his mayoral campaign recently. So it's quite a varied background, and one of the benefits of that, and on top of that, I'm a military historian. That's my original background. I originally intended to go into the army and studied military history, but then someone invented this internet thing and people started paying me to do it, and I never kind of got around to it after that. All of those things, though, are important, I think, to kind of understand where I'm coming from, what I want to try and get across to you today. And what that really is to give you three things at the end of this session. Firstly, a kind of an understanding of the human role that is part of governance. This is something that is constantly overlooked, and it's one of the big flaws, and it's one of the big reasons that most governance systems fail, particularly in information technology, IT, and digital, because we are people who love systems and technology. Generally speaking, we would not be in this job, in this industry, in the roles we play unless we had a particular passion for those things. And that means we tend to think of things through a lens of technology rather than through a lens of, say, human behavior. And as a result, governance structures that, particularly on the information technology side, get created tend to suffer. The other thing I want to leave you with is some basic pragmatic principles that you can use to sense check governance models that you're going to put in place. We will have time for questions at the end, and I'm absolutely happy to answer questions about specific issues people may have with governance or models or anything like that, or even some of the models we use at Greenwich. Happy to talk about those too. But I just wanted to kind of get up front that the real goal here is to get you into a position where you can sense check your own governance models or the models you're being asked to manage or run. Similarly, what I want to try and do is leave you within that with some of the kind of handy techniques you can use to force others to consider your governance model. Now, that may sound a bit weird. I'm not talking about partly getting your leadership teams, whether you are on it or whether they are people reporting to you as a leadership team, getting them to understand your model itself, but getting them to deal with the issues that those models throw up, because actually people dodging those issues is actually how most of your governance failures happen. So just very, very quickly, I wanted to kind of stop and talk about why this is important. I don't think there's anything on this slide that will particularly catch anyone out. What you're looking at here is DCMS figures for organizations that reported a breach or cyber attack in 2019. I think what you can see from this slide, though, and the bottom bar on each of those sections, which is brown if you can see the colors, the bottom bar is always the one that relates to further or higher education. And what you can just see by looking at that as a trend chart is that as a sector, we face stronger issues of governance than pretty much any other regular sector, because we are huge targets, both for cyber attacks, we are huge processors of data, and we are often very large organizations with an incredibly diverse workforce, both geographically and just as people and in skill sets. And that means that we are a big target for this kind of thing. So I just wanted to put this in context and highlight that when we talk about models, and within this presentation, I'll talk a lot about things like web content governance models, but also briefly things like mobile self-device usage models and things like that. All of those things apply, because if we don't have strong governance on our systems, then we are more at greater risk than most of problems. And that's really emphasized even further when you look at data breaches. Now, 54% of universities reported a data breach in 2019. That's from the Red Scan report. It's a relatively comprehensive survey, actually. So it's not one of these kind of numbers you see pop out in the media every now and again and you go, hang on, let's have a look. And they've only surveyed like 8 institutions. This is quite a wide-ranging report. And what it doesn't give us is a sense of scale on that. But I think it's worth remembering that every data breach matters. It doesn't matter whether you've accidentally kind of had a breach that has caused you to accidentally reveal 10,000 bits of personal information or 2 bits of personal information, or both of those things matter. And even if it's the latter, it's an indicator that you may be at serious risk of the former. So again, that's just to give you the rough context as to why this stuff matters. I think what's also important to consider is, just as much as we are more risk than many other sectors of these problems, and why we're more intrinsically in need of strong governance within our systems, particularly on the IT and digital side, it's also worth considering that we face a considerable amount of challenges that, if not unique, they're unique in their combination. We often face situations where IT systems or digital systems have been sourced through multiple sources, or if they're websites, they might be running on different platforms, they might be hosted in different ways. Faculties or subdivisions often have independent budgets, systems, and politics as well. And all those come into play to conspire to create a situation where people, it's very hard to build up a full picture of all the systems that are in place and what you control. One of my favorite things to do with talks like this, when I'm in person and when we're delivering in person, is to do the quick show of hands in the room and to turn around to people and say, if any of you are responsible for managing the number of your university's website domains, so just your domains, do you think you know exactly how many domains your institution owns? And it's always remarkable to me when anyone puts their hand up. I have an ongoing bet with our infrastructure manager at Greenwich, which is that every time one of us discovers a new URL that we didn't realize the university owned, we have to buy the other one a drink. Now, obviously, the current situation and lockdown has, to a certain extent, putting that on pause, the cashing in of that. That bet's been running for 3 years. And at least every month up until now, one of us has been buying the other one at least 1 or 2 pints. Because this is one of the big challenges we face as institutions. Similarly, recruitment and budget restriction limit handovers and continuity. And I cannot emphasize enough how much your governance models need to model this in. We'll talk a little bit later about the importance of kind of accepting organizations as they are, which many of these things are. But that really is a killer. That third bullet point is something that just absolutely has to be accepted. We live in a sort of false hope that things will get handed over within education. And that doesn't happen. The amount of instances that you can count where a new role holder has arrived before the old role holder has departed are tiny. Generally speaking, they are tiny. So having any in any suggestion that consistently you can expect handover is just something that's not worth doing. Similarly, we often require our staff to be multi-role or multi-skill in a way that other organizations don't. If you think of the workload that your average academic has to do in a university, for example, they have to fulfill in many ways multiple roles. They are a researcher, they are a teacher, they are someone who has to promote their own presence and image online. They are someone who, if they do personal tutoring, essentially has to act as a mentor and in some cases a surrogate parent almost for people. All of those things are diverse roles and skills, and that's just on the academic side. If you move that into the professional services side, we hit similar issues. You often find that the person who you are reliant on to make technical decisions in a governance model are actually people who that's not their primary role. It may not even be half their role. Sometimes you're lucky if there's even a third of a role. And what that does is it's something, again, that you have to design in and deal with. If you're not accepting that situation exists, you're going to be in trouble. We've talked a bit about lack of system transparency already, but this is this principle that you don't know all the systems that exist. You just don't know. And if you're building wider governance models that have to handle things like content across the board and what happens online, that gives you problems in that regard. And similarly, multiple systems delivering the same service. In Greenwich, to my knowledge, there are only 3 different content management systems, 2 of which I control, 1 of which I don't. I think that may actually be a low record for a university of our size to only have 3 CMSs, and it took an awful lot of effort to get to that point. Regulatory obligations and limitations on us, particularly in governance terms now, if you go back 10 years, we didn't really have to worry about things like personal information as much. We didn't really have to worry about things like the Data Protection Act as much. More importantly, recently, we now have greater obligations in areas such as accessibility. And those span over multiple IT systems and multiple digital platforms in a way that users just don't understand and that private companies don't understand either. Also, actually, frankly, in ways that people bidding for work with us as institutions don't understand. A considerable part of my time is occasionally spent gently explaining to other departments that, yes, they have spoken to someone on the phone who is offering a very nice product, but that product is not accessible and therefore we cannot add it to our library. And it's just being malicious, it's just a lack of understanding. And finally, and this is something we'll touch on right at the end, universities are very military in some ways. We have hierarchical knowledge cultures. Now, a lot of organizations have hierarchical cultures. What makes the universities and the education, schools are similar, unique, is that they often possess hierarchical knowledge cultures, which is where you have both a sort of a desire to doff the cap to role, to seniority, but also a suggestion that caps should be occasionally doffed to people who are senior in knowledge and not in rank, and that brings unique problems. So jumping kind of straight in, what we really need to accept here is these 5 things. And if you can take these 5 things on board, if that's the thing that you come out of this with, and we'll dig into each of them individually, this is the real roadmap and your cheat sheet for doing good governance. Ensure the right information reaches the right people at the right time. We'll touch on all of these in detail in a bit. Design governance for people, not for systems. I've talked about this already, but again, I think this is arguably the second strongest point you will find throughout this entire talk, is you have to design your governance for the people who it is going to have to govern, not for the systems that it is running. Accept the operational reality, all of those things we've talked about before, and create balances for it. But the role of your governance is to even out the problems that exist within your organizational structure to a certain extent. If those problems didn't exist, if everyone had the right knowledge, if everyone had the right responsibilities, if everyone understood everything they were doing, and if all systems were brilliantly built, you wouldn't need a governance model for them. So you have to accept the operational reality. And finally, these 2 last ones are related, and we'll consider them in a related sense later. But hardwire in the concept of ownership and create senior management responsibility. If you do not have those 2 things, you do not have a governance model. I'm just going to say that up front right now. If you cannot engineer those 2 things in, you do not have a functional active governance model. Now, the difference between an active and a passive governance model is that sometimes you don't really need your governance model to govern or to oversee things. All you actually need it to do is exist. Again, my standard hands up test at this point is to ask people how many people have a social media presence in any way, and then to ask them if they can remember any of their organization's social media policy. A social media policy within an organization exists to be read, if you're lucky, when someone joins, and then used as an absolute hammer to beat people with if they do horrible things online. At no point in the middle is there anyone who's going back and either A, checking it's enforced really, or B, self-enforcing it. It's a passive policy rather than an active one. And what we're talking mostly about today is how you create active policies and active governance systems in areas where you need to create active ones. So let's consider the right information, right time, right people, right time. To do this, I'm actually going to turn to someone whose name is now overlapping their thing because the alignment's slightly off. I will have a word with my slide designers. But I want you to introduce to a chap called Hugh Caswell Tremenhere Dowding. You may recognize the name, you may not. This is back to your clues that I'm a military historian by past. Dowding is famous for creating something called the Dowding system. And this is a quote from Dowding himself, who was Air Chief Vice Marshal in the RAF before World War II. He said, "In the coming battle, information will be as potent a weapon as the fighter plane." Now, even if you know who Dowding is, and we'll talk a bit more about him in a second, you may not know what the Dowding system is. So rather than explain it in the context of that, what I normally try and do to people at this point is direct them to a short clip that they can watch. Now, obviously, we are very careful in Greenwich and elsewhere about rights issues, as we should be. And one of the things I cannot do is show you a clip from the film The Battle of Britain. What I can do is show you a clip of the Battle of Britain recreated entirely using 1.72 miniatures. So we're just going to watch 2 minutes of this because it gives you a very good idea of what the Dowding system is. You don't need sound, but hopefully you do get sound, as I am running on a Windows machine. Now that was Dowding at the end there, popping up and asking who was covering Dover. If you haven't guessed, the Dowding system was the system that the RAF introduced to cover the RAF home defence in the Battle of Britain. Now, Dowding himself came up with this in 1936, and what he created is one of the finest systems of information management and governance that actually has been seen, to the extent actually where modern air forces still use this system today to manage defense over strategic territories. But actually, what you can see here is some of the underlying principles. And if you think back to what our slides were earlier, you can see that there's a reason why Dowding is actually in many ways regarded as one of the fathers of information governance. Because what he had to create to allow a vastly inferior air force to deal with a much bigger one was an incredible system and network of things that allowed decision making to happen at key points, but also allowed people to do their jobs in a very good way. Now, actually, what he did was create three principles behind that. Dictate strategy and roles centrally. So you create a high-level strategy that's easy to understand and features clear roles, and then you iterate that as required. Again, these are principles that apply as much when you're designing information governance models as they do when you're running fighter jets, because as Dowding had rightly identified, the war was won with information. He was going to win that battle by ensuring he could make sure he was at the right place at the right time. Create signal, not noise. Now, this is an important governance principle overall. Give people only the information they need to do the job in hand. We have a tendency sometimes, particularly when we're pulling together IT or HR government systems. Again, passion plays a part in this, but we tend to overshare. And actually, again, we'll talk a bit more on this later, but oversharing is bad. If you are not keeping the information you are providing a user or an individual with what they need to do the job at that particular time, then what you're doing is creating noise. And similarly, trust people on the ground. We talked earlier about how this works and about institutions that have kind of devolved control. And there's no way you can't trust people on the ground because you can't see everything that's going on. The Dowding system becomes even more obviously in the system of information management when you see it mapped out in this way, which is very similar to how you might map out, say, a network control diagram or actually a governance model itself. We actually model some of our governance models not dissimilar to this, and I even use the same colors because it's quite useful. I'm not quite sure in Dowding's system what orders he was issuing to barrage balloons, because I mean, go up or go down seems to be about the limit there. But these are those things that existed. So what is the right information? Now, again, this is particularly important to understand. The right information is both the stuff you do up front and the information that reaches people as they have to make decisions within your governance model. Up front, you want to be thinking very, very carefully about clear and simple concepts. Now, when I say this and I talk about making these things clear up front, I'm going to actually use an actual example here this is one of the governance principles that exists for our university website. We do not store personal information on the website. Now, that is a deceptively simple concept. On the one hand, it seems quite obvious. Why would you store personal information on the website? But actually, when you think about what a university website or any large organizational website involves, it's actually quite complex behind the scenes, because it involves lots of micro decisions about things like, well, where do we store email addresses from mailing lists? What do I do if I want to run a form that collects a bunch of information from our students? What do I do if I want to include details of our graduate students? What do I do if I've got some people related to us who are doing research and I want to share documents with them? But all of those are complex questions that we could in some way wrap in, and we do have various policies around, and we verbalize those policies. But actually, they're all siloed issues that will affect different users in different ways, and they all relate ultimately and can be answered by this simple bit of governance. We do not store personal information on the website. It is absolutely vital that you get and distill the key points of your governance of whatever the system is down to that principle. Similarly, with own device policies is another good example. Your own device policy should have a clear sentence that says whether it is acceptable or not to store email on a phone. You know, it sounds stupid. It's the foundation of an own device policy. It should have a clear policy on whether you can have unlicensed software on that machine. Again, it sounds silly, but 90% of people sitting at home have unlicensed software on their computer. These are the things you want to distill down to simple things that people can understand in simple ways. Looking at this again, one of the things we talk about as well is clear and simple roles. I think this is another one where it can be quite hard to kind of grasp what I mean with this. So let me push it over and show you in this context. So what you're seeing on the left is common roles that might exist within, for example, a content management system, a CRM. They might exist within an email platform even, or they may exist within pretty much any system that you get. Within a university, you often find that there is a vast hierarchy of permissions and role structures that exists within bits of software. Now, often these exist because they exist within the product. You know, product designers are creating products that are for lots of different people to use, so therefore they fill them with as many features as possible. But actually, if you want your governance model to work, the thing you need to do is engineer out as many of those roles and processes as possible. So on the left, you can see how many of there are there. There's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 levels of user that existed within the governance policy that existed prior to us bringing in prior to my arrival at the university, actually. When we actually did a full audit as part of our governance exercise, one thing we were very quick to establish is of those roles, only 4 actually need to exist. Now, hold off your kind of thoughts about those last 4 that are on that list at the moment that I've grayed out. So you might be looking at it and going, well, hang on, why would you not have people within individual subdivisions of directorates or departments? Why would you not have specific roles for them and similar? Again, we will come back to this a bit later when we talk about how you kind of enforce and police governance models. But for now, trust me when I say that one of the things we assessed was that actually in a good governance model, you want as few of those as possible. And that was the 4 we realized we could get it down to. You also need a clear indication of where decision making happens. And this is something that doesn't really need much explanation. And again, we'll touch on it slightly later when we talk about ownership. But people at the bottom need to know who they should talk to rather than where they can read things, because people are very bad at reading things. And certainly that really applies, again, with the idea of clear route to human help. They need to understand who they can talk to about that governance, because chances are you have not covered what they regard as their specific circumstance in your governance model. You may think you have, and in reality is you may well have. In fact, when they contact you, you may well be able to just direct them to a thing that answers that question. But they are going to ask you that question. And if they cannot ask you that question to a human being, you're innately reliant on them either magically finding it or just pretending it's not an issue and carrying on. The minimum amount of information necessary to do a particular task is particularly important as well. You have to make sure that it's there and you have to make sure it's valid. if they're not getting the minimum amount of information, they're getting too much information, they're not going to know what to do with it. But more importantly, most people face issues of governance at specific times. So they don't sit there and consider all the likely issues they're going to have under the thing that your governance model applies to up front. They consider it when it comes to a point. And that point is always the point at which they're taking an action which the governance model should cover and potentially has questions or issues with. A really good example of minimum amount of information delivered at the right time is this, which literally everyone who is on this thing will have encountered this pop up at some point. An update for an Adobe Acrobat is available. The close neighbor to this is if you own a MacBook, is that little bit that pops up in the corner and says, would you like to update your PC now, or would you like to update it later? Generally speaking, there is no, I would say that the percentage of humanity who have ever clicked yes on that the first time it has popped up are tiny. And with regards to the Adobe installer, although they've changed this now in several and later versions, a lot of that was because it wasn't delivered at the right time. What would often happen is if you follow the kind of the journey that a user was taking through, they would have received a PDF that they need to read. They would double click on the PDF to open the PDF. And then before they can read the PDF, which is the thing they need to read, it would turn around and go, do you want to install an update now? And people would always click no, because it's not the right time. Now, actually, one of the things you should be doing, and potentially, and they've changed this in some versions of Adobe on some systems now, is making sure that even if you're going to prompt at the beginning, you prompt at the end too. It's the reason that later option pops up on MacBooks and now on PCs and similar, is because you really need to just make sure that when they do need to make a decision, or when they can make a decision, is the point where you're providing the right information. We talked earlier and again on our principles about design governance for people, not systems. And frankly, this arguably makes up the largest part of what we're dealing with here. What I want to make very clear with regards to this talk is there's going to be lots of bits coming up where I maybe sound slightly facetious, and that's not intended to be this way. What it's about is being honest. And this is, again, important with your governance models, is the governance model has to be honest. It has to reflect the reality. We talked about this under our principles. There's no such thing as common sense. I really can't emphasize this enough. This is the very first and most important point that you can make. If common sense existed, you wouldn't need governance models. There's individual sense. What happens is individual sense pulls people in the same direction in homogeneous groups. It makes it look like common sense exists. Groups of people who are from similar backgrounds or work in similar ways on a very low specific level will behave in similar ways. Common sense exists if you live in a 14th century medieval village, and chances are you will probably not be happy with some of those things that common sense says that you should or shouldn't be doing. But it doesn't exist in large organizations that require people from different work groups, different working tasks, different social and economic backgrounds, and different countries and cultures to work together. If your governance model in any way relies on elements of common sense, it will not work. Nobody reads the terms and conditions. Lengthy policies and procedures will at best be read once and forgotten. My wife is a senior biochemist at a hospital. She's just joined a new hospital. She has just spent 3 days going through every single bit of e-learning that you are required to do when you join an organization. A lot of that will stick with her and it will be on board because she's good at her job. But if you can imagine the likelihood of anyone really remembering everything from that amount of pre-work, it's not going to happen. And one of the big problems you will have with your governance model is if it requires people to remember things that they learned up front. Remembering, again, our Adobe thing. If they're not reinforcing that point at the point it happens, then they're not going to know it. And one of the questions you then need to ask yourself, given that all of us work in time-poor environments and that governance is about kind of making sure, maintaining it and keeping it up to date, is if no one is going to take on board the things that you raised at the beginning or you asked them to read at the beginning, then why are you writing them at the beginning in the first place? The time and the effort that you would put towards that could be better off looking at building triggers or guidance or whatever at the points, specific intervention points where people are doing those things. Smart people make bad decisions. I know this is engineer's disease. One of the great joys to me is every time I give a governance talk in different sectors is hearing someone else say, oh, no, we know that as X disease. And the X is always a different career. But really what it all comes back to the same thing, which is, as I say, smart people make bad decisions. There will be plenty of people watching this who know this already. If you have worked in any way, or if your job role involves doing the elements of cybersecurity, you'll know that actually some of the biggest risks you have in a cybersecurity sense are your smartest people, because it brings often with it a belief that experience is automatically transferable, that because I'm good at one thing, that means that the moment I pick up something else, I must be good at that as well. And it leads me as an individual, and I do this as much as any of us do, to overlook some of the simple things we should be doing because we don't need to worry about them. Good people will justify bad decisions to themselves under pressure. This we will tackle right at the end because it's an absolutely critical point. But a lot of the issues that I see when I look at where governance models need to either be brought in for the first time or improved exist not because anyone did anything malicious. They exist because someone who is an otherwise good person made a decision that was a bad decision, but because of the specific sequence of events they went through felt right at the time to them. And that might well be because they lacked knowledge, but just as often, and it's important to say to kind of, declare a spade here, just as often that happened because someone incredibly senior said to them, just make it happen, just do it. We need it now. We need these things to happen now. Go do it. I don't care. I know maybe you're not meant to upload that file to that system, but we need to share it. We need to email. We'll take it down after. It's fine. Just do it. Just do it now. If you go back and look at kind of information commissioner reports, particularly for this sector, a considerable percentage of data breaches that happen in this sector happen because of that. And if you are designing a governance model that is designed to limit things like data breaches or cybersecurity breaches, and you are not considering within your model how you prevent good people from being put under pressure to make bad decisions, then you haven't got a problem. You've got a problem. You've got an equal problem if you don't consider how you make sure that even if the good person thinks they're doing it, you still manage to stop them somehow. All of this really adds up to the simple fact that ultimately good governance is a form of social engineering. That is, it's hacking people, not products. Obviously, technology supports good governance, but if your governance model at its heart is not designed around the people who are using it, it will not work. So let's look a bit at addressing the common sense problem. So the clear thing here again is to accept that common sense doesn't exist. Even if you happen to be lucky enough to have an organization that does have a very strong organizational culture that's turning in the same direction, it doesn't really exist in the way you need it to exist. Or more commonly, what kicks in is Sod's law, which dictates that the one time you do need people to do something that you regard as common sense, they decide it really, really is common sense to do the opposite. So as we've talked about already, what that really means is making sure that critical actions are not reliant on common sense. So if one of the things you need your users to do is to assess whether a thing breaks a policy or doesn't break a policy, then you need to be very careful about how you communicate the things you really need them to understand. Now, that's a slightly wordy way of really getting across that, and again, to use an actual example, it's probably easier, is if you have a legal obligation to not publish a certain bit of content online, then you need to make sure that somewhere in the responsibilities document for the person who might publish that is a clear bit that says, do not publish this information online, or do publish this information online, but only in this way. Make it very explicit where you need to be very explicit, but try and avoid then over prescribing everything that should be done. So I'm kind of aware that there's a slight conflict there in some ways with some of the things we've talked about already, but just pick the points where you need to be very specific and make sure that they're points that have a clear outcome, not things that might happen. So often one of the things that again, we'll talk a little about later that causes grief is people tend to try and try and predict every different outcome that might happen from their governance model. You can't. But what you can very easily do is go and speak to the university lawyers and say, what are the 3 things that definitely need to not happen here if we don't want to get sued? what are those things that do need to be in there? Because let's make damn sure those are in there, and everything else we can kind of be a bit fuzzier about. Again, as we talked about, that ties in with making sure all responsibilities are clear and in plain English. The plain English part is really, really, really important. If your governance says things like, for issues of this, you need to refer to CPD plan 102.0 or whatever else, it's not helpful. Going back to the fact that people do these things when they are at the point of trouble, or they need to do stuff, people will brush over it. They'll go, well, I don't have time to go and find that document on the internet, but it probably just says that I shouldn't swear in this thing I'm uploading. They will fill in the gaps. They will assume they can use common sense to fill in the gaps to save time, and you really, really, really need to avoid them doing that. Officially test competency and understanding before giving someone a role. This is something we do quite ruthlessly in our content policy, for example. One of our permission structures, and again, if we've got questions afterwards, I'm happy to talk people through how our permissioning structure works. But we have very clear roles that relate to who can publish on the website and who can't publish on the website. And the simple fact is, if you are a person who needs to publish stuff on the website, you 100%, regardless of whether you are the vice chancellor or the temp from who's just joined, the student ambassador who's just joined to race through a bunch of big uploads that marketing needs to do. If you have approval permissions to publish things on the website, not author, so just to add stuff, but if you are someone who can approve things to go live, you must have attended our half-day workplace session, which talks about what your role will be. And more critically, within that session, our information officer actively makes them sit a test, and that test tests whether they understand what personal information or not, and we mark it then and there. And then if they pass that test, that's brilliant. They can become an approver, and they can be designated an approver up to 2 years after they've sat their test, as long as they've passed. If they haven't, we don't. So that really, really then kicks in then with the issue of what you do and how you deal and make sure that common sense doesn't impose. Now, that model I've just described brings other issues, and we will touch on some of those other issues later, which is the urgency issue. Why? But I really need this done now. You're not running another course until next month, and this thing needs to happen now. Now, actually, there's been a slight hint into some of the ways we deal with that in some of the earlier slides, and some of you may have spotted it, some of you may not. But think back again to our permission structure. Think back again to what I told you the roles were, and you'll start to see how when you take all of this together to carve out a governance model, how these pieces start to mesh together to complement each other rather than conflict. And finally, create catch-22s. Now, I'm not actually going to explain what this is right now because it's going to come up on the next slide again as well. But trust me, you do want to create them. So let's look at the second one of our list, which was I accept the terms and conditions. This was that people don't read things. Again, create at-point guidance, not extensive documentation. Extensive documentation is useful to relatively few people and arguably no one. My general rule within the governance that sits within my domain is that if a policy or governance document is over 3 pages, it's not a policy or governance document, it's a paper tiger. This is back to that passive and active governance things again. If you just need it to exist like the social media policy, make the damn thing 40 pages. Doesn't really matter. But if it's your content policy on what is acceptable to go on the web and what isn't, you're incredibly lucky if anyone is going to read 3 pages. If you can, make it 1. And if you can't make it 1, then it's not going to work. You can't make it 3, it's not going to work. It is too complex for regular people in pressure doing their normal jobs to implement. Create strategic intervention points. Now, that ties into our catch-22, which problem again. But what you're looking to do is ensure that if there is a point in your governance model where it is the last chance to make sure something doesn't go wrong, that there is no way for the user not to hit that. Now, that is actually where technology does come into play. The one thing that technology and systems are really, really, really good at is computer says no. And what you really need to work out within your governance model is where you can allow things to flow, where you can allow people to make decisions, but where is the absolute point where you need them to just have a conversation with you. And all you're trying to do is make it so the technology stops them at that point, and then they have to talk to someone. They have to talk to whoever within the governance structure is further up the chain and would spot an issue. Domain registration is a really good example of this. We centralized all domain registration for the simple reason that we could hopefully try and get some kind of perspective on how many domains we owned earlier. We theoretically had been doing that before. The thing that I did differently when we came in and started doing this was I realized that the actual check and balance on people registering domains, or us being aware of them registering domains, isn't them telling an IT department about it. It's that they're either going to try and make it, they're going to pay for it in some way. They're either going to invoice for it, or they're going to pay for it and then try and claim it back. Quite rightly, because they should. In which case, your actual technical intervention point on has someone just registered a new domain is your finance department, not your IT department. If you speak nicely to your finance department and buy them beers or chocolates or anything else and turn around and go, when you see this specific item appear, and you get them to insert a line item for it so that people can tag it with a code, when you get one of these, ping us an email. Now, actually, half the time those are legitimate because people are doing good governance. But actually, what it does mean is suddenly you know what 99% of your domains are rather than at best 80%. Now, let's talk a bit about catch-22s here. So obviously, this is the famous quote from catch-22. Sure, there's a catch, Doc Danica replied. Catch-22. Anyone who wants to get out of combat duty isn't really crazy. There was only one catch, and that was catch-22. Which specified that a concern for one's own safety in the face of dangers that were real and immediate was the process of a rational mind. Now, one of the things I love about Catch-22, and this in particular, because it brings out my governance geek, is people read that and go, oh, Catch-22s, horrible thing, circular situations. I look at them and go, that is one of the finest strategic intervention points ever created by a governance system. Because actually, it's a really good example of something that turns around and goes, well, actually, here's a force to consider. Now, actually, it's only half a governance system. If you're doing it properly, like legitimately, what you'd actually have is that's the point where it turns around and goes, actually, let's do a fair psychological assessment and let's work out what someone is and everything else and all those kind of things. But this is the principle that you're trying to emulate. What you're trying to do with a good governance system and with the enforcement of good governance is create points, particularly within education, where you create either a logical fallacy that a user has to do, or something where they have to admit that what they're asking to do is a bit silly. Because people's personal embarrassment will always trump them making a bad decision when it comes down to it. It will at least make them pause. And this is something you want to do. So if we look again at our roles briefly, you'll see here again, we talked about how we're getting down to 4 roles. Now that ties in to the fact, so our roles are root administrator, faculty administrator, and faculty author. This is within a specific CMS system that we run. Now, again, I talked earlier about having really, really simple concepts that people can understand. A second one of our website concepts was this. Faculty administrators must check all content for personal information issues before they approve it. These are the people who have gone on our courses. Now, when we were talking earlier, you might have been, I was saying, well, what happens if that person's not around? Well, now that we've got simplified roles, what that actually means is we can train more people in those roles. So rather than having lots of different granular people below them and people saying, well, it's not my job, it's not my job, you can kind of go, well, actually, you were trained in it. So on a faculty level, in our instance, where we get and we do get those panic moments of someone saying, this person is now on holiday for a month, we have no one else who can do this. We can turn around and go, yes, you do, there's 3 other people. There's 3 other people there and they've all been trained. And they all know this stuff better than my team will, or people centrally will. They may not be subject matter experts, but they're faculty matter experts. You're more likely to get them knowing what's potentially personal information than me in real context. So what you're doing really with this is you're inserting a catch-22, a strategic intervention that plays out something like this. So on the left, this is us. On the other side is them, a user, in this case, a faculty administrator. And they might ask, they might turn around. These are, by the way, names have changed, but these are genuine conversations I've had over email with people within our governance when they have stressed our governance system rather than broken it. Heller permissions to approve things. Sure, I can make him a faculty administrator. No, we just want him to be able to approve his own team's stuff. Now that is your first clue and flag to the fact that maybe there's a governance issue here. We can't do that. It's a faculty-wide role. Do you want us to do it? So what you're doing there is you're re-stressing to them that there is no way to kind of give them just that little bit of permission structure. They have to have more roles if you want them to do that. And really, again, as I say here, what you're trying to do is force your people within your governance model who have to make decisions to make decisions, but also consider what they're asking you to do. Because 9 times out of 10, it's better if you can get them to consider it, have that light bulb moment and back down, than you just try and kind of enforce governance on them. Is there no way to do it? How can I put this? He's important, but a bit of a character. I would hazard that many people who are watching this have had a similar conversation about a similar individual, whether it's in a current role or a previous role. It is always an element of, well, they're really vocal. We kind of can we just let them do their own thing? And again, that's how data breaches happen. That's how cybersecurity risks happen. It's decision fatigue or issue fatigue is not an excuse to break governance. And that's one of the big things to take away again, is you need to create these points where you can do that. And this is where that catch-22 things come in, because ultimately if they've admitted this, you can then turn around and ask them that. Then why would you want him being responsible for PI or data protection decisions about anything? Why does it matter less that he can make PI decisions about his faculty than he can about his team? Now, actually, half the time these conversations are happening over email, and what you might need to do beyond that is escalate it if it doesn't lead to a back down. But what you've created within your governance, by the way you've created your roles and where you've staged your strategic interventions, is a system that allows you to do this, allows you to force conversations about difficult topics with human beings. And 90% of good governance is having complex conversations with people about tricky topics. Managing engineers' disease. The best thing you can ever learn to say is it's not personal, it's policy. Generally speaking, people who suffer from engineers' disease, again, myself included, we tend to have quite strong opinions about our own self-worth. And we don't like having those dented. The easiest way to get around that is to say, I agree, you're absolutely brilliant at what you do, but unfortunately, it's policy. And building that in and making it acceptable for people that your governance model is overseeing to say that is really critical. Teach the people who are your strategic intervention points, whether that's your faculty administrators as much as your own staff or teams. Teach them it is okay to use these techniques to do these things to enforce governance. Create working policies to overcome astronauting. One of the things I say in Greenwich is I am always incredibly suspicious of meetings that involve biscuits. Meetings that involve biscuits are meetings that are clearly designed to eat biscuits rather than have things actually happen, because they suggest that the meeting won't go on long enough that you need some kind of sustenance. Often a lot of these meetings relate to things where people want to explore all the full implications of a thing that they are doing, or to, in governance terms, map out all the potential outcomes and come up with prescribed routes for them and how we deal with them. Those things, A, delay time. They create time delays in implementing good governance. And B, as we've talked about, in many ways, they're going to be pointless anyway. One of the ways around this is to agree to have those meetings and do those things and to have those conversations with people who suffer from engineers' disease, because they want to have that. They love the idea of scoping those things out. And it's really useful in some ways, but it shouldn't delay you getting a working governance system. And the best way around that is something called working policies. You say, that sounds brilliant. We will have that meeting next month. Until then, our working policy is going to be that we don't upload things that have personal information in them, or our working policy is that staff photos on Microsoft Outlook should be of themselves, not cats. And we will debate the ability of a pet to represent a person at a future meeting, but right now that's our working policy. The best thing about working policies is, generally speaking, working policies have a habit of becoming the starting point of an actual policy, because when it gets to the bit where anyone wants to write a policy, it doesn't happen. Allow exemptions with senior ownership. We'll touch on this a little bit further on towards the end. But what I'll say for now is, it's your governance. Your computer might say no, but your governance never should. What your governance should always say, yes, but. And the but is always, particularly for higher risk scenarios within your governance model, is always yes, but someone very senior is going to physically put their name to it. And we'll talk about ways of doing that a bit later on. The other thing is to be very, very wary. We talked about having those meetings and astronauting. Over-engineered governance will create rules lawyers. Rules lawyers is a gaming term. If you ever played Dungeons and Dragons, you may know it or have encountered it. These are people who arguably, the moment you confront them with a 40-page bit of governance documentation, they consume it, they love it, they live for it, and they will read it, and they will read it, and they will obey it, but they will obey it in its absolutely strictest form. As I say, this is a Dungeons and Dragons term. It's ways, people who will read rule books and they will go, actually, well, if I use this spell in combination with this spell and everything else, I can fire an arrow at the moon and reel it in. And they feel very pleased with themselves, and that's their achievement. Now, in governance terms, it's incredibly dangerous when you're coming to things like online governance, because what you end up with is situations where someone goes, well, you've spelled out all the different ways my profile picture can look on Outlook, or you've spelled out all the different things I could upload. And actually, when you look in it, it does say that PDFs are an acceptable form of upload. So what I've done is I've converted my business objects file. I've just changed the extension to a PDF and I've uploaded it. And they've not realized that you change the extension back and suddenly you've got all of that information that was in it. That's what you've got to watch with rule lawyers. I mean, in Dungeons and Dragons terms, in gaming terms, it's very easy to deal with. You just do that. You turn around and go, well, the other thing that's in a rule book is a level 60 mithril dragon, and I'm just going to drop one on you and it's going to eat you. But it doesn't play out. There's some very, very real world examples of this happening at the moment. Again, I won't go into them, but as the constitutional lawyer and David Allen Green says on Twitter at the moment, someone asked him, it must be quite fun being a constitutional lawyer at the moment. And he said, being a constitutional lawyer shouldn't be fun. The moment it's fun, something's gone wrong. I'd say being a governance expert at the moment is very similar. I've never been retweeted so much in my entire life, and I don't like it. And that's because of something we confront at the moment, which is probably best described as the Scotch egg problem. This is something the government is facing or has faced at the moment, which is the question of which of these is a substantial meal. Now, this is a very good example of rules lawyering in action. It probably made absolute sense to turn around and go, well, actually, there's a definition, or there's a term within existing licensing laws that says that that certain restaurants can serve, pubs can serve substantial meals. That's what they've then used as a basis for some of their decisions on who can and can't open during certain tiers within UK lockdown rules, which is fine until you realize that actually there's some very, very lawyerly elements of the definition of a substantial meal, and now everyone is arguing over them. Rules lawyers will exist. You have to always keep in mind how you handle that when you're doing things. Preventing bad decisions under pressure. So create catch-22s, we've talked about those already, and create those strategic information points. Provide access to a single central role with absolute authority. Again, we talked slightly about this before, but really what this is about is turning around and accepting that you need to make sure that people have someone else they can talk to who's outside of their direct chain of command. Because whatever their hierarchy is in their faculty, chances are that one of the people who is pressuring to do things is within that hierarchy. If there's no one outside of that, whether it's adjacent or in a central sphere that the governance allows them to speak to take a breath and get perspective, you're going to have problems. And finally, most importantly, create a culture of specific and real ownership. You know, this is that last point on our principles slide, is create a culture of ownership and senior responsibility. Because without ownership, your governance will fail. Now, your governance model to work needs several of these immutable rules of ownership. Everything must have an owner that needs to have an owner within the governance model. That it just does. You can't have things that don't have an owner. If you do, you don't have accountability. More importantly, everything must have a senior management owner. Now, that doesn't mean they have to individually own every document on your website or every device that is used in a bring your own device system. What it does mean is they have to own all the stuff their faculty or directorate or department is doing. And they have to know that they own that. And that's very important for something that we're just going to catch in a second, but they have to know that. And the government's model must have a senior management owner. If you as the implementer of governance do not have someone that has your back, if you are not that person yourself, then you're in trouble. And if you're a senior leader who is watching this, as many of you are, then make sure that the people you have working for you who are implementing ownership and governance. Know that you have their backs. Be vocal and active when they're under pressure to establish and reinforce their behaviors. And that's really critical when we have this hierarchical knowledge culture within the sector. It's absolutely critical. And finally, as we talked about before, exceptions are allowed with a digital or physical signature from a senior management owner. That bit's crucial. You need that signature. That signature has to exist, because if it doesn't exist, it's not real to you if you are the person signing off on a thing, or to someone else signing off on a thing. And it's also there to ensure that if something does go wrong, and it will occasionally go wrong, that people are very clear that actually the governance worked. Within the limits of what it could do, the governance worked. And what it actually highlighted was potentially cultural issues or issues of an individual that need to be addressed in resolving that situation. What you don't want is your governance model to become a scapegoat for things that would have happened no matter what. If you didn't have a governance model, that person was still going to let that person do that thing. So don't let the bathwater get thrown out with the baby. And again, let's explore very briefly another catch-22 that this produces. You know, again, this is a real conversation I've had in many ways. I need to do something the governance explicitly prohibits. It's really important. This is back to that whole thing of people will come to you, and they will come to those who use your governance models and say, but it's important. I need to do this. No problem. We can help with that. You can. Oh, that's great. We just need to get your senior manager to sign this, saying they accept the risk. That's your intervention point. That's your strategic point, because it's going to force them to do one of two things. It's going to force them to consider whether what they are asking you to do is genuinely important. And it may well be. But if that does, it's fine. It allows you then to go and get someone to sign it off. You know, you get to go and say, don't worry, if it's important like you say, then it shouldn't be a problem. And that person will potentially sign that thing off. And that's fine, then it can happen. This is particularly useful if, for example, you need to throw up a website for a particular event, or if you need to use Eventbrite just briefly for this one thing. Governance models are there to manage risk. You can't eliminate risk. All you can do is minimize it. And the model should minimize as much of that risk as possible. But actually, it should also accept that there is an innate risk that you can never extinguish. And that risk is there's someone at the top standing around and saying, well, we're just going to do this anyway. And again, that's fine. What you hope is that that senior person signing that off has in some way discussed it at a board level or whatever to establish that the organization is happy taking on that risk. But all you can do is encourage that behavior within your governance model. So my very final point that we'll just talk about within this concept is this. It's that without senior ownership, your governance will fail. And that senior is absolutely critical. Whether you are the senior manager or senior officer who it falls to the role within doing that, or whether you are reporting into them, your governance needs to make it very, very explicit that they do have a role to play in this. Governance is not a replacement for leadership. And I think that's one of the big things that many, many organizations fail with, is they assume that if they've got strong technology and strong governance, that replaces leadership and the ability to treat people in a human way. Actually, both technology and governance support human beings doing good things and leaders doing good things. And if there's one lesson that we need to take away from that, it's that. Nothing really has highlighted that and highlights it more in a governance sense. And this last thing that we will just consider before we finish. This is the Challenger disaster. In 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded and took the lives of 5 astronauts. The reason the shuttle exploded was because of a flaw in the rubber insulation that linked its fuel tanks together on its large, kind of huge rockets. The flaw was that the rubber turned out that when it got really, really cold, it would become very rigid. And obviously, rigid rubber does not stretch. It would not fill the gaps that it was meant to stretch. That led to gas and fuel escaping, which ignited and blew up the whole shuttle. Now, this had never happened before. Now, part of the reason this had never happened before was because temperatures had never got that cold. But also, the governance that NASA claimed after the event should have stopped this. They said, well, we've got strong governance models about everything. We have all of these wonderfully strong governance models. There's Richard Feynman wrote some very good essay on all of this and how NASA's mathematical models that they'd established proved that there shouldn't have been a shuttle accident. There was less than a 0.0001% of there being a shuttle accident, but there was. So why? And one of the reasons it came down to was this. If you are in a leadership position and you have not read Diane Vaughan's book, The Challenger Launch Decision, I cannot recommend it highly enough. It is one of the best texts on how governance can fail that you will ever read. It is a riveting read, but it is one of the best texts on how governance can fail. It is also an incredibly good read on leadership under pressure. I think there's conversations about one of my other things I talk about a lot is quiet leadership, how you manage and lead in situations where it is hard to do so. This is another very good text for anything you want to know about that. But just to finish by kind of giving you the details here, this is the specific point at which the decision was was reached. Marshall managers at Cape began challenging Firecol engineers, who were the people who built the rubber, what was called the O-ring, interpretation of the data. And their data was saying that if the shuttle launched at under 50 degrees Fahrenheit, then there was a risk that the things would freeze. The O-ring reached that temperature. Malloy, who was the senior manager, stated that since no launch criteria had ever been set for booster joint temperature, what Thiokol was proposing was to create new launch commit criteria within their governance on the eve of a launch. Malloy then exclaimed, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April?" Because NASA were under political pressure to launch this shuttle operation. And this was the senior manager involved turning around and saying, actually, you know, that's a big thing. If we don't launch here, that's a big thing. And that's really where this came in. This was the consequence of that phone call. After some discussion, Thiokol's senior vice president, Jerry Mason, said, "We have to make a management decision," thus excluding the Thiokol engineers from the decision making. 3 voted in favor of launch. Lund, Thiokol's chief of engineers, hesitated. Mason asked him to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat. Lund voted with the rest. NASA had a governance process in place to prevent that launch. It might not have had the specific criteria that it needed at that time, but it had a governance process in place. What failed in that situation was not governance, it was senior management and ownership. And again, if I can leave you with that one point, all of the things you can do to create good governance models will not work if you have not closely bound your governance model in with the concept of senior management, ownership, and leadership. And that's one thing that obviously ucisa is very good on in very other ways and other people can talk about. But I just wanted to leave you with that. And then just again to revisit a final time those last slides, just to remind you of the pragmatic principles here, which is ensure that right information reaches the right people at the right time, to design governance for people, not systems, to accept the operational reality. Don't believe or hope that your organization will change to allow your governance model to work. It won't. You have to design the governance model for the organization and the people it is going to oversee. And hardwire in that concept of ownership, but more important, make sure that as part of that ownership, you create a level and an understanding of senior management responsibility. And if you are a senior management who is a manager who is overseeing one of those governance models, make sure that you are very visible in participating in the way that your employees, your staff, that your managers need you to operate within. And that's it. I mean, as I say, hopefully I've left some time for questions there. So I'm happy to answer questions about anything. I will have to stop screen sharing so I can actually see them. But yeah, I'll do that.
Thank you ever so much, Gareth. That was a really, really excellent session. Really, really engaging presentation for everyone here attending. And I'm sure I speak for everyone, and thank you very much for taking the time to deliver that to us today. Just a reminder to all our guests that if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to post it in the chat, or otherwise you can use the raise hand feature, and we'll just ask you to bring yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite happy to scroll back up the chat quickly, but I'm conscious it was a long session, so if there was any that popped out that need re-emphasizing,
not at all.
Feel free.
I can fire some to you.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. Yeah.
Someone did ask about recording. They had to leave early, and thank you very much, by the way, there, Gareth. And just an answer, if anyone else is wondering, this session is being recorded and it will be made available on the ucisa website. But I'll start off with some of the questions. So Chris asked earlier on, does competency include a willingness to comply? So I think that was in reference to when you discussed testing people when giving them that kind of authority.
Yes, it does. And I think one of the things that gets most overlooked is that actually it does include willingness to comply. If someone is not willing to comply, you'll often find this with things like web governance, in particular, or anything that's related to giving out devices and taking them back as well. But particularly with digital content governance or things like that, you will often get people turn around and say, right, well, that may be a policy, but I just don't believe in it. I'm not going to do it. Or you might get people who say, well, this isn't really my job. I've been told I need to do this. And actually, one of the things you need, and this is again where you need senior management ownership of your governance model as anything else, is you need to know that you have the ability to revoke someone's ability to do things independently. That just because, say, their faculty has turned around and said they're the person who should do this, that your governance model allows you or someone else to turn around and say, but they're not fit to do it. The competency tests we do are a really sneaky way of doing that in some ways. So, because one of the things that you're trying to do is there's a principle of actually London Underground use when they're doing one of the reasons that fare evasion checks happen is actually because people who evade fares actually often have records for other things. And so what often happens is you'll find that there are always police lurking by when you've got fare invasion happening. And what it's because it's to do with kind of looking for associated activities. And frankly, testing people for their ability to identify personal information is very similar. If someone goes into your training session to work out what's personal information to upload to the website and they can't pass that test, what you often find is they also can't pass the bit where they have to know what a browser is. So what you actually get to do is exclude them on genuine reasons without having to exclude them on grounds of competence. But you can then point them back and go, well, actually, here's how you train to be better. Here's what you need to do. But often I find with those individuals in that role where willingness comes in, they're grateful for it because they didn't want to do this, or they already had 4 responsibilities and they're being overworked. It's very critical when you define your roles within your governance to establish within that an estimation of the time involved. If your faculty administrator role for us, for example, is currently down as 0.5 FTE, if they are giving someone that role, it is 0.5 full-time equivalent. And therefore, they have the right to turn around and go, we'll take away other bits. You know, it's that kind of thing. So you do have to engineer that in. But yeah, willingness, absolutely, is part of it.
Thank you, Gareth. Kevin asked, how might you cope with people being given roles that they don't want? So I think this sort of falls into what you've just said.
Yeah, same thing of what I just said there. I mean, you have to know that there's a route around them. And again, this is why your governance model needs a separate level of ownership than the ownership of whatever. If you are, for example, someone who needs to implement rules with regards to document ownership and how long they are kept for, then you need to know that actually there's someone on the senior management board who is the person who's backing your governance model up, who can turn around and go, that person in that faculty does not want to do the job, and that they can talk to that senior faculty person, their equivalent in the faculty, and say, you need to appoint someone else. You know, it needs to be something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Martin asks, in your opinion, where should the senior owner of governance ideally sit within an institution, or could it be a separate entity?
I think it depends. I think it depends on what you're trying to implement. If you're implementing web governance, then actually where the web governance should sit and does in Greenwich should be wherever your web team sits. It should sit with the director of that department. In our instance, that means it sits with someone who is known to ucisa, Paul Butler, who is my director and is very good at it. So therefore, I know that if I need to go to someone, I can do that. With regards to the independent side, though, what I would say is if smart governance model recognizes that you should have the rank is not necessarily the same thing as being a person who can make a decision. So bound into our digital governance at a root level is the fact that there are 2 people who can at any given point for any reason hook a bit of content or a web page or even the entire website. It's outside of the kind of standard hierarchical structure of VC and everything else. And that is me, and that is our information officer. Either of us, even though we are far down the pecking order in these things, have the absolute authority wired into that guidance to take that decision, and it is there in black and white. So I'd say a bit of both. Work out where the best path upwards for the person who's running the governance is, but also work out whether you need kind of bits adjacent to that you can have those kind of strategic and critical moment intervention points. You know, that point where someone can come in and just say, that's coming down now, and we'll worry about the consequences later.
We also had a question from S. Harrison. Do you find that governance issues are closely related to a lack of understanding of risk management?
Yeah, in fact, I'd argue they're the same thing. Human beings are absolutely awful at assessing risk. We just can't. We can't do it. It's not a natural trait we have. I always think there should be an inverse. The Darwin Awards get it wrong. There should be an inverse of that. We should give awards to people who actually correctly identify risk rather than laughing at people who don't. But yeah, the two are related. And as I talked about in the talk, actually what you're really looking at when you're doing your governance bit is you are having to turn around and work out how you wire into your governance risk assessment, because you can't ask anyone to do it. Like, unless they're professionally trained in it, unless they're a really good project manager, they're just not going to do it, or they're not going to do it right. They're not going to assess it in the right way. So that's why those strategic intervention points are important. The two biggest ones that come up with our digital governance, for example, is sort of the two I highlighted in our thing. It's someone turning around and going, we want to give this person the ability to do everything. And you go, well, they don't need the ability to do everything. They just want the ability to do everything. Or it's where you get someone turn around and go, I need to upload this really, really now. And you look at it and go, that's the minutes from a thing. And I've seen what's on the appendices of that, and that should not be on the website. As a side note on that, the University of Greenwich website could theoretically have granular levels of permissioning to every single team or staff member or student. We could turn around and let people upload a document that is only visible to members of a particular seminar group. That's, you know, we have a really nicely closely bound system. The actual only allowed levels of gating on the university website are public and Greenwich community, i.e. staff or student. And that staff or student one, that community decision is deliberate, because one of those catch-22s, those strategic intervention points, that's incredibly handy, and I highly recommend to anyone who has to implement digital governance, is someone getting in touch and saying, I need to upload this file, but I only want staff to be able to see it, not students. And you go, why? What is in that document that students shouldn't see? Because chances are, if it's something that students shouldn't see, what it actually means it falls foul of is one of our other clear policies, which is anything that goes should be assumed to become public at some time. And you go, right, well, if you don't want students to see it, it can't fall that. And actually what happens is one of two things. Either people go, yeah, actually I suppose there's not really a problem if students see that, and then they let it go. And in which case you've just got a nice simpler setup anyway. Or they go, all right, so what you're saying is I should maybe share this via OneDrive. And you go, yeah, maybe share that one via OneDrive instead, where that's someone else's governance problem, so I'm fine.
No, that makes sense. So often it is best to keep, well, I guess that's one of the reigning principles, is keeping the steps to a minimum and keeping things simpler.
Complexity is the enemy. I think if you want one single rule that can absolutely abide above every bit of governance, complexity is the enemy. If your system, if your governance is complex, it will not work.
I think we can all definitely relate to the sort of terms and conditions that you sort of find yourself consistently ticking yes to, but you know, you've got absolutely no idea what's contained within, and you don't have the time or the interest to find out.
Yeah, the other one I'd say the biggest lie that humanity has ever perpetrates is exactly that. It's the I have read and accepted the terms and conditions. I'd say the second biggest lie that humanity perpetrates is that bit at the beginning of any meeting where someone turns around and says, can we all agree that we've read the minutes and agreed with what's in them? And everyone nods and go, oh, yes, no, I've read the minute. No one's ever read the minutes, glanced at them at best. So yes, and again, there's no point fighting those behaviors within your governance or within your model. Just model around them. You know, you have to model them in. If you don't model them in, you've just got paper.
Now, I can't see any further questions in the chat, although Paul has shared something quite interesting about Conway's Law.
Yeah, Conway's Law. Conway's Law is a great one.
Organizations design systems which copy the organization. I've not come across this before, so I'd love to hear more.
The weird one is it's another one where I think it's a double-edged sword. It's absolutely correct, and done badly, what tends to happen is people model in that whole principle of they believe that organizational common sense exists. So they go, well, we'll do these things this way because this is how we've always done them, and this is how people will always do them, and we don't need to have extra rules around this because it just works. But I think also it does actually highlight a very good point, which is if you're not critically assessing the way your organization does things and making sure that you build in rules around how to behave within that, then you're getting it wrong. So I think it's one of those things a bit like Catch-22, where it's actually in theory it's a negative, but actually if you understand and accept that it exists, you can actually turn it into a positive.
Yeah, that definitely seems to be a key theme, not trying to fight the sort of human nature behind a lot of these unwritten laws and rules. Now, there's also a lot of thanks for your session. I can see in the chat, people really found it quite excellent, I think. Very grounded and honest. We had Beth say, great presentation. So thank you again, Gareth. That really goes to show just how much people have appreciated you taking the time and delivering such a great presentation on this. I'll just ask the audience if anyone has any last questions they would like to either switch on their mics and cameras for and join in the conversation, or if you want to post it in the chat. We're watching it with eager eyes.
And what I would just add on to that is you can find me on Twitter at Garius, and you're always welcome to email me at Greenwich. And yeah, if anyone ever has a thing, I'm more than happy to kind of just give my 2 cents. I'm that kind of person. I'm very annoying like that. So.
No, that's brilliant. We've had a lot more thank yous come through in the chat, and I'm sure plenty of people will be happy to fill your inbox with separate questions and issues, Gareth, so you might regret sharing that with us. But if that's, we will be sending out the video. Yeah, don't worry, we'll send that to everyone who's registered to attend this event. We'll send you the link to the recording in an email, and it will also be available on the event page on the ucisa website. So no fears on that. I suppose now it just goes to say thank you so much, everyone, for attending today's session. We hope it was really useful to you, and that you got a lot out of it. And special thanks to you, Gareth, for taking the time. This has really been just such a wonderful session for all of us, even for me, who has absolutely nothing to do with anything like this. It's certainly given me something else to ask for Christmas, which is that book you suggested, the Challenger Launch Decision.
It's an incredible read. It's an incredible read, and I do, just as a general read, I highly recommend it. But yeah, no, it's brilliant. And again, thanks to everyone for watching me ramble on for an hour and a bit.
Not at all. Well, thank you, everyone. It doesn't seem there's any more questions, so yeah, I think we'll draw this to a close there. Thanks again, Gareth, and have a great afternoon, everyone. And Merry Christmas, I suppose.
Yeah, Merry Christmas to everyone.
Yeah.